Welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our launch of a guide for Houston philanthropy. We are excited to share this guide that is available not just to our donors and clients, but to other foundations, nonprofit partners, and the entire greater Houston community. My name is Diane Higginbotham. I'm one of the senior philanthropic advisors here with the Greater Houston Community Foundation, and we welcome you. The intro music that you heard was provided by Symphony Pringle and Gregory Lewis of the Community Music Center of Houston, one of the Black-led organizations in the guide. We appreciate them for providing the music for us today. I will just add, you'll forgive me, you'll notice that I might be looking down a bit. I do have notes, please forgive me. I have a lot to say and this is so important, and so I don't want to miss anything. We are monitoring questions throughout the webinar. Please send your message using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. We have reserved about 10 minutes at the end of the hour to answer some of those questions. If your question is not answered, we will do our best to reply to you individually after the webinar. Please put your question in the Q&A box, or you can email us directly at connect@ghcf.org with your questions, and we will share that email address again at the end of the webinar. Later in the program, you will hear from my colleague, Renee Wizig-Barrios, and two funders, Holly Lewis-Hudley and Ramon Manning, who will join us in conversation. So this crazy year that we are all experiencing actually marks the Foundation's 25th anniversary, and we have adopted a new purpose statement: to inspire and create meaningful and positive change with our donors and for our community. This purpose statement speaks to why we have chosen to embark on creating the Giving Black Guide. We can't say we inspire and create and that it's for our community if our actions don't start to reflect that. This is a very intentional step in that direction. I'm going to start by answering what we think might be some underlying questions that people may be having. The first big question is, what is GHCF doing as an organization internally around racial equity? Like most organizations, we have been reflecting and actively working on our role in addressing systemic racism, beginning with us launching a new effort to develop a comprehensive, effective, and sustainable plan to address racial equity challenges within our own organization. For example, we compared our disaster relief grant-making funds and grants from our donor advice funds with the list of Black-led organizations that we compiled to create this guide. Out of the 126 organizations that we initially gathered for this guide, 38 have received funding from either our donor advice funds or disaster relief funds for a total of $14.6 million, with just over $8 million of that from the disaster relief funds. And I do just want to be clear, when I mention disaster relief funds, I'm referring to like the Hurricane Relief Fund, the Imelda Relief, and the COVID-19 Recovery Fund that we did in partnership with United Way of Greater Houston. And just a quick note of distinction here, for disaster relief funds that GHCF administers, we have been adding an equity lens to how organizations apply and how final decisions are made, and are continuing to work in that area. And I'll just note that when I refer to racial equity lens, what that really means is it has many components, including analyzing data and information about race and ethnicity, understanding disparities and why they exist, looking at the root causes of problems, and naming race explicitly when talking about problems and solutions. Now, with our donor advised funds, the donor actually recommends the grants that go out from those funds. So GHCF doesn't have any discretionary funds other than when we administer disaster relief funds. And so part of our role is providing educational opportunities such as this to offer our donors new ways to enhance their giving. We do realize that there is much work to do, and we will continue to work on behalf of our donors with our community partners to support dialogue and healing across Houston. We hope this guide can support that dialogue and allow our donors to channel their feelings into actionable steps regarding their giving, as many have reached out asking how to do so. The second question that might be floating around is, what can you expect from today? Let me start by stating what won't happen. I don't normally like to talk about what we're not going to do, but in this case, let me just start with that. We understand that we cannot unpack all the biases and racism that are embedded in our philanthropic systems. We know that, and we only have an hour, so that won't happen. What we do hope will happen is for you to hear from two funders about their journey on giving from a racial equity lens. We also hope that their stories will inspire you to think differently, about how and where you give your philanthropic dollars. We will also show you the guide today and encourage you to utilize that. So the third question we think you might be wondering about is, why did GHCF decide to focus on Black-led organizations? As this quote from Jeff Rake speaks to, Black leaders bring a racial lens to their work, creating effective solutions and striving towards equitable outcomes. We also know that strong Black communities and institutions contribute to a more equitable future for everyone. So if philanthropy wants to find the best solutions to the toughest community challenges, which are often in Black communities due to underinvestment and systemic racism, we must invest in these great leaders who have innovative approaches and solutions. This quote by Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, speaks to the idea of change making rather than grant making. And it states, as funders, we need to reject the impulse to put grant making rather than change making at the center of our worldview. Listening, learning, and lifting up voices who are most proximate and most essential to unlocking solutions is critical to the type of change making that we seek. But in changing mindsets, we have to recognize that there are barriers for Black-led organizations. And that leads to another reason why we chose to focus on Black-led organizations, the fact that they are often underfunded and face unique barriers to funding and investment. The Bridgespan Group and Echoing Green spent several months interviewing more than 50 sector leaders, including nonprofit executives of color, philanthropic staff, and leaders working to address this issue. They identified 4 key barriers to capital faced by leaders of color. 1, getting connected to potential funders. These leaders do not have the same access to social and professional networks that allow for connections in the philanthropic community. 92% of US foundation presidents are white, 83% of other full-time executive staff are white, and 68% of program officers are white. This stat is from Overcoming the Racial Bias in Philanthropic Funding, which we will provide a link for in our Learn More section. And according to the American Value Survey, 75% of whites have entirely white social networks. This lack of access can have substantial influence on an organization's growth and survival. 2, building rapport with potential funders. Interpersonal and unconscious bias can sometimes prevent relationship building. One thing we teach in the Next Gen Donor Institute is about the inherent, but often unintentional, power imbalance between funders and grantees. This imbalance can be emotionally wearing on Black leaders, as it might manifest as mistrust or microaggressions from the funders. The term microaggressions is used to describe intentional or unintentional verbiage or behaviors that communicate derogatory or negative attitudes towards the culturally marginalized group. 3, securing support for the organization. Funders sometimes are not familiar with culturally relevant approaches to change and over-rely on evaluation and strategies that are familiar to the funder, but do not necessarily apply for the organization or the community. Black-led organizations can fall into the chicken and egg trap. An organization needs funding to build their capacity and measurement and evaluation practices, but funders are hesitant to provide funding without these in place. Additionally, historic underfunding in these organizations and Black communities are more often the culprit, as there is more skepticism and scrutiny. Funders can also sometimes look to their own understanding of what works to assess if an organization is going to have an impact or not. However, if the funder does not have authentic relationships within Black communities or a deep understanding of the issues facing these communities, the organization's culturally relevant approach may not resonate. And 4, sustaining relationships with current funders. Grant renewal processes can be hard if mistrust remains, or may stop if the funder defines strategic priorities and progress measurements for the organization. As mentioned, one of the barriers for Black-led organizations is not having access to philanthropic networks. One of our goals of this guide is to support our donors in diversifying their sourcing pools for organizations, which led us to creating the Giving Guide. So let's talk about our methodology around developing this guide. For this purpose, Black-led means the CEO or executive director is Black. It's not perfect. We understand it's not perfect. We were seeking to take a very intentional step, and I think that's what we've done. It also doesn't mean that all the organizations listed in Giving Black are supporting the Black communities either. We also spoke with other community foundations who have done work in this area to learn from them and to see what worked and what didn't work. We then took a list that was created and already started by Black Philanthropy Houston and built upon that. Knowing that we needed to reach outside of our networks, we reached out to community partners to review the list we started and asked them to add additional organization names, and they did. We verified that all the organizations that we had had good standing with the IRS, because we do require that the organizations listed in the guide be a 501c3 or have a fiscal sponsor. This is done to make it easy for our donors to make a grant recommendation from their donor advised fund. We then created a survey to ask permission to include the nonprofit and to use their words and what their impact has been. We asked them to categorize themselves according to our 8 Understanding Houston topic areas. And if you're not familiar with our Understanding Houston initiative, please check it out at understandinghouston.org. In the end, 70 of the 126 organizations that were on the initial list responded and gave permission. And we want to thank those organizations, most of whom are on today's webinar. So thank you. Now that I've shared more about the guide, it's time to do the walkthrough. We're so excited. I'm so excited. We have created a new website for the guide, GHCFgivingguide.org. At the top, you will see several categories, which are from our Understanding Houston community indicators. The nonprofit selected all the categories that apply to them, so you may see them listed in more than one. If you click on one of the categories, such as arts and culture, you will see these boxes with information from each organization. So you'll see their name, you'll see the county that they serve, so it could be Harris, Fort Bend, or Montgomery counties. You'll also see the impact statement, which is in their words, and whether or not they were a recipient of a GHCF disaster grant, such as Hurricane Harvey Relief or the Greater Houston COVID-19 Recovery Fund. You'll also see a contact name for them, possibly an email, and a website link. If you click on the hyperlink, it'll take you directly to the organization's website. You can also search for specific terms, such as Third Ward, and you can put that in the search box, click on the arrow, and then it'll bring up the organizations that contain that term in their descriptions.
Thank you so much, Diane. I want to give a huge shout out to Diane Higginbotham for her incredible work on the guide, along with our colleague Annie Hurwitz, who wasn't able to be with us today, and our marketing team, Alicia Jacobs, Allison Sullivan, and Rachel Young, who all brought this project to life. We are really excited to share it with our community and hope that you will all find it as inspirational as we did. We also just want to mention that this is a living guide. And so Diane will talk about that more in the closing of the program, but we expect it to grow. We did our best to reach out and learn about as many organizations as we could, but we know Houston in the nonprofit world is always flourishing and new initiatives start every day. So we do want you to understand that this will continue to grow and expand. I want to invite Ramon and Holly to turn their cameras on so we can see their faces as I introduce them, please. We really want this to be a conversation. And at the Greater Houston Community Foundation, we're all about donors learning from each other, learning from research, learning from best practice, but we know there's really a special way in which peers want to learn from each other. And we feel like it's a really positive thing for people to learn from each other's lived experience. So we have with us today two people who I think are really amazing community leaders, and I've had the pleasure of knowing them both for some time. I'm going to give you brief bios on them, and obviously there's more I could say, but we want to hear directly from them. So Holly Lewis Headley is a native Houstonian with a long career in the arts, mental health, and education, and is part of the Lewis Family Foundation. We're also really proud that Holly is an alumni of the Next Gen program at GHCF and a really active part of multiple funds here, such as Gen Impact and the Anti-Human Trafficking Group. Holly is really interested in learning how systems and individuals can work together to create healthy and inclusive communities. She has worked in the intersection of philanthropy and social and racial justice, and she seeks to align funding with community-driven ideas. She is also a mother of 3 boys, a hobbyist woodworker, an artist and writer, and a perpetual learner, currently working towards a PhD in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. She currently sits on the board of A Second Cup and Justice for Our Neighbors. Ramon Manning is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Partners Capital Holdings, a private investment company, and board chair for Emancipation Park Conservancy. Ramon was born and raised in Houston, and his achievements span both the public and nonprofit sectors. He is chairman of Emancipation Park Conservancy. And for those of you who don't know, Emancipation Park is the oldest public park in the state of Texas. It was founded in 1872 by formerly enslaved African Americans. As an education advocate, Ramon also serves on the board of Houstonians for Great Public Schools. He is a proud graduate of one of the largest historically Black colleges and universities, our very own Texas Southern University, where he received a bachelor's in business administration. While attending Texas Southern, Manning was a 4-year football letterman and a member of the golf team. He and his wife, Karen, reside in Houston's 3rd Ward with their 3 children, Morgan Ann, Mason, and Matthew. So as I kick off this dialogue, I want to remind everyone that you are welcome to put questions in the Q&A. We will have some time for questions after our discussion, and if we don't get to all of them, we will answer them later. So really, to begin our conversation, I'd love for you both to reflect a little bit and share about your personal involvement with Black-led organizations and how you've experienced some of the themes and the barriers which Diane was talking about so far. Holly, can we kick off with you, please?
Press the wrong button. Isn't this like getting so typical on Zoom? Where's my mute? Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, even though we can't see you. I want to say, first of all, before I get into sort of a little bit of my history, while I speak for myself here today, I think I come into this conversation with a lot of other people in my mind. Some of them are just kind of here with me, I want to say. So Black Philanthropy Houston, which I think did even helped shoulder some of this work today. LaTanya Flicks, who was a former employee at GHCF and still works alongside you guys in a lot of ways. Luana Kimbrough, Randy Holmes, Cleve Tinsley, my husband, Josh Headley, Kyle Wright, all of these people and more, so many more are people that are collaborating in this space and really trying to get this conversation going. So it's not just me and Ramon, which is encouraging and good. So thanks GHCF for doing the part to really bring this to the forefront in this community. Some of the perspective I want to be able to offer is being in conversation with donors who look like me, so who may be white, who may be next-gen wealth inheritors looking to do things a little bit differently than maybe they have been done. And I want to also say that I don't think that the idea of community-led philanthropy or trust-based philanthropy, community-guided initiatives is not a new concept in historically disenfranchised communities. I think that the community is what my favorite word in the GHCF acronym, right, is what are we doing to uplift, build, and empower the greater Houston community. But it is different for philanthropists to think about the wider community rather than about our individual goals. And I think it kind of requires us to think of ourselves as part of a collective rather than as individuals who want to do specific things with our individual either inheritance or wealth. And it's, to me, a good analogy is kind of becoming part of a quilt or becoming a part of a greater fabric. My friend Siba Suber once quoted to me the shortest poem ever written, which was by Muhammad Ali, and it goes like this: me, we. And I want to say that that's kind of why we do this work, is to see that while we may be sometimes thinking and speaking for ourselves, to hold the greater community, to hold a greater equitable hope for the future in mind. So I'm here to kind of help imagine that world. Renee, do you want me to talk about my history or let Ramon go ahead and kind of say a little bit?
That's fine. Ramon, why don't you kick off with some opening remarks, and then Holly, we'll go back to the history.
Yeah, thank you, Renee. First, I kind of want to give a shout out to the Greater Houston Community Foundation. I think this is extremely important for multiple reasons, but I think as we kind of look at kind of where we are as a country and as a society, I think this authentic, real discussions like this are long overdue. So I just want to take this opportunity to say, kudos to the Greater Houston Community Foundation for stepping up and addressing this. My intro, as it relates to service and philanthropy, is really around family. There are people that have been in my life that have exposed me to more community than anything. I think about my first exposure, and I credit a lot of this to, Auntie Sylvia Brooks, who's the president and CEO of the Urban League for years. I think about people like Judge Zanetta Burney, Aljanita Scott Davis, Michelle Barnes at the Community Artists Collective, because these people kind of sat me down and explained to me not only how important this is, but also highlighted where some of the inequities are. And it's allowed me to approach volunteerism, community work with intention, if that makes sense. And, it is an honor for me to be in service at Emancipation Park. And, most people don't understand because they just don't have the visibility into what we're talking about today. Because as you look at philanthropy as a whole, it's somewhat insular. It's a small community. Everybody knows everybody. And if you don't have those relationships, you often, just kind of get shut out. Now, I don't think some of that is by malice. I just think just by human nature, we tend to do things with people we know and have relationships with. And so you know, my exposure to all of this is really credited to a strong family network and a group of you know, leaders that came way before me that, I mean, just to be blunt, drafted me and said, "This is what you're going to do, young man." And if you know any of these women I just named, you don't tell them no.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think great to see that both of you are, in a sense, talking about who brought you in, but also who you're in this work for and with, because clearly none of us can do any of this alone. We've got to rely on other people to help shape our thinking, to help challenge our thinking, to help us grow. And so I think that's an important theme for us in this discussion about equity, is that we need to expand the networks from whom we gain information and who we build trust with in order for us to build our community. I certainly know that for all of us who come into this work and service, we come because of our care for the community and because of the people that we know we've seen suffer that we want to see a different future for. Certainly that's been an inspiration for me too. Talk a little bit now, Holly, and then Ramon, about your own personal experience with Black-led organizations and just whether you've seen some of these barriers that Diane lifted up from the research in reality in our community.
Yeah. For my history in this regard, my longest history is that since I was 17 years old, I have been engaged with or part of or on the board of Project Row Houses in 3rd Ward. And, you know, I love that organization, and it really kind of gave me a great picture of that quilt, right? It was started by 7 Black artists who really engaged the community around Project Row Houses to participate in the thought project, and that continues today. And you know, as a teenager, being part of that, seeing that was powerful, because I didn't grow up in that neighborhood, but I was there every Saturday for a good number of years, just tearing sheetrock off the walls and getting these row houses together. But my involvement over the years over there has definitely been a big part in shaping my thinking and seeing the power of community. But it's also how I understand the intersection of creativity, history, and Ramon, you know, with your work with Emancipation Park, history is absolutely important to lift up in this city. There's some pieces of our history that have kind of been allowed to go by the wayside that are being brought back into the forefront for their importance in Black community and culture. And the other 2 intersections are justice and impact. So someone once said to me, well, we just need more Rick Lowe's in the world. And Rick Lowe is awesome. He's a friend, he was a mentor. I think I also want to say there are dozens and dozens of Rick Lowe's, and they have great ideas, and they have good ideas about community, and they need access to resources and capital. So it shouldn't have to be like, oh, someone was just in the right place at the right time. But creating networks where people with good ideas can be situated so that they have access to capital and resources to build out their ideas. This is what I think of as like a fractal effect, right? Like small things happening in big ways. And there are a lot of people with great ideas. It shouldn't have to be sort of one leader in the community shouldering the way forward. So that's my personal history. It has started and continues with Project Row Houses. But then I will say that the deeply personal part of this for me is twofold. One is looking at our economic history in this country. We would be remiss if we weren't honest about the economic inequity that has been born in this country, in large part due to our history with enslavement. And that means that a whole section of our society was left out of the economic process. And so we are seeing that inequity kind of play out, where maybe we can say, well, we did all the right things. There's the civil rights movement, et cetera, but there's still such an inequity or a barriers to access. So community-driven organizations tend to start small. They don't have the ability to hire a full-time fundraiser. So they're relying on people to give of their time or people to work contract, and that limits access to capital. So if we can build up these community networks, these community organizations, then we can increase participation and equity across our very diverse city. The other part that for me is really, really deeply personal is my kids. You know, one of the things I was kind of laughing when it said, like, my title was artist, mother, and educator. All of them are true. And I realized, well, actually being a mother is the most important part of my title for me. To be completely transparent, my kids are biracial, Black, white. And part of imagining this world is imagining a better world in which they can participate in, be part of, and contribute to. So the fact that I'm a mother of my particular boys makes me also want to sort of mother that work into the world in general. You know, if we can think of like a birth analogy, and I won't go there entirely, but we want to birth, Ramon, he's like, we want to birth a new world. And I think part of it is creating equity. And I think we start with economic equity. Not start, it's one aspect of it. How about that?
Those are really powerful comments, and there's so much to unpack there. I'll just say two things before we get to Ramon. One is that, you know, unfortunately, we've all learned in history about the charismatic leaders, but we all know that it is a collective leadership that makes any movement happen. And that was one of the fundamental things I learned back in community organizing many, many years ago. So I absolutely agree with you, Holly, that we make a mistake in philanthropy when we focus on just a few bright stars, when there are so many people who need access. And then also the economic data is very clear in Houston. If you haven't really paid attention to our Understanding Houston website, when we did our data on social and racial disparities, we lifted up the wage gap between white and Black earners in our region is about $40,000 annually, which is just really terrible. So this is borne out in data that because of systemic racism and lack of access to education and many other factors, Blacks in Houston are not building wealth in the same ways other communities are. Ramon, your thoughts on being involved with Black-led organizations and the barriers that you see?
You know, that's that's an interesting question. I know we're limited on time, so I've been sitting here listening to Holly and just kind of gathering my thoughts. You know, first, impressions have an effect on you when you're young, and some things you kind of never forget. I remember being in high school in the summertime, having to go to the Urban League and work. And I specifically remember, and this was my first exposure to community kind of nonprofit, really rolling your sleeves up work. I remember it was in the summertime where in most cases, when you're in high school and in the summer is where you look forward to sleeping to noon, 1 o'clock. But I remember specifically having to get my butt up in the morning and go down to Texas Street downtown to the Urban League building and help with, if it was registering folks to vote, if it was a small business program, phone banking, picking up the phone, calling folks. And it was through that experience I began to kind of have visibility into inequity, you know, and it just gave me a different view on why we had to be doing what we were doing that summer. And it stuck with me, and it still sticks with me, right? And as I think about growing up as a young man and now having a wife and kids and doing the work that I'm doing at Emancipation Park, you know, all of these people I mentioned to you guys earlier when we first kicked this off, they learned to swim at Emancipation Park because they couldn't go to any other pool in this city. Like they were forbidden to go to any other pool. So this is very intentional and deliberate on my part. And I've had this kind of stick with me for so long. And unlike traditional kind of green spaces when you think about, parks and, the flavor du jour is, quality of life and all this good stuff, and all that's fine. But how do folks get in a position to have a great quality of life and participate in these things if they can't put food on their table, if they don't have gainful employment and earn a good living wage? And so what we've done at Emancipation Park, I think, is very unique when it comes to a green space, is that our programming is very deliberate and intentional to the constituency in which this park sits. So think about it from a perspective of a B2B approach. So instead of us not being in our ivory tower thinking, okay, well, we've raised some money, we're a Black-led organization, we can do these programs. Well, as Holly mentioned, there are a plethora of people in communities of color who look like me, who have been doing this work for years. So what we did was took a B2B approach and said, how do we, as a conservancy, give mini grants to community organizations so we can create a high tide, all boats rise environment in the community? And I think, when you ask that question, Renee, about my exposure, everything that we do is intentional. It's not, when you think about parks and green spaces from a leisure perspective, right? We want leisure to be in the mix, but we have to do stuff around education. We have to do stuff around nutrition. Up until we got this new HEB on the corner of North McGregor and 288, Third Ward was designated as a food desert. So, how do we have programming that addresses, when you look at 77004, 77021, you got high blood pressure, diabetes, hypertension. How do we address some of these things with the programming coming out of the park? And HEB has been great, with partnering with us on some of these things. But really, it's about service, and it's about how do you address some of these needs in the community in which you live.
Thank you for sharing that and for really drawing out the fact that you relied on the community to generate the programming and not just on your own brain trust at Emancipation Park. I think that really speaks to best practice of getting proximate to the community and relying on community leaders. Let's have some honest talk about some of the barriers you've seen. So as you've tried to raise funds for Project Row Houses or Emancipation Park or other Black-led organizations that you feel passionately about, that you trust, that are doing amazing work, have you experienced any barriers in working with other foundations or other donors or other friends that you feel like are worth reflecting on so that we can all think hard about our own role in this situation?
Holly, you want to go first?
Right. It's a big one to unpack, Renee, and I don't know that we're going to be able to unpack it in this hour. I think, one question that we could put out there that is just a personal reflection is, what personal biases have we either been raised with or have we inherited from our culture or from the way that systems work, which have, as was pointed out earlier, historically favor white men, right? And so what biases do we come in with that may previously have been invisible to us that we need to see? There's a mystic that I love who said the whole of life lies in that single verb, see. We need to learn to see. And so if we can't be honest with what we see, both from within and also what we see in our society, we can't really have an honest conversation about what those barriers are. So I think it's personal reflection is part of it. And second, some of this was already mentioned. It's the ability to network. Okay, when a system is begun by people who look like me, then that system is carried forth by people who look like me, and that becomes the network. So for someone to break into that network who may not have been in it previously is difficult. It requires trust building. And that's kind of part of the way that, in my mind, I am with other folks imagining recreating philanthropy. Can we build trust in a way that doesn't do harm? And part of trust is trusting that, as Ramon said, community members know what they need. I don't need to come in and be like, I know what you need. You just need what I had in my life growing up. Because if we're willing to listen, and another word I think you said, Renee, or maybe Ramon, is one of my favorite words. And I know Luana will appreciate this if she's listening. It's from Brian Stevenson. It's proximity. Brian Stevenson says, in order to understand a problem, we have to get proximate to it. We have to draw near. If we stay, as Ramon said, in our ivory towers, thinking I can fix these solutions from on high just by throwing money at it, then we're not connected to the problems on the ground. And so proximity means showing up, staying in, even when it's hard, thinking it through, willing to engage in conversation, willing to look at the plethora of data that already exists. There is so much data that exists that tells us what racial inequity does to a body, to a psyche, and to a community. That data is there. Trust the data. You guys have provided a lot of data. So there's already filters that we can trust to come through that can say, hey, come on in, the water's fine, and so proximity and trust, I think, are two issues that we need to face.
Absolutely. And challenging always, but more challenging during a pandemic when it is more difficult to get proximate. But I don't think we can let ourselves off the hook because of that. We're going to have to lean in differently. Ramon, your thoughts?
That was a very, very interesting question, Renee. And I'm going to kind of stand up and testify like we in church. I will admit that upon starting the first African-American conservancy in this city, and thinking about board construction, thinking about all of the things that you think about when you build an organization, I will admit to you that I thought, okay, well, you put a board together, you raise a little money, peace, I'm out, and the more and more I got engaged, the more and more I began to see things. And that is so not the case. What I've witnessed is that there was always this notion that, a lot of community organizations, they need back office infrastructure. They need capacity. They don't have this or they don't have that. And I've always been a big proponent of doing due diligence and research, especially on my targets, as I would call them, when I'm going out seeking partners for funding. And I've seen in the philanthropic community, good and bad, I've seen some organizations fund a startup organization and have in the funding document capacity, building, operations. And then when you look at organizations who've been operating in the hood, who've been doing it for 20 or 30 years, Renee, they use an excuse to talk about capacity and back office infrastructure, reporting tools to not fund somebody. And so there's often this notion of associating risk with community, African-American community-led organizations. And I don't know what that's about, but what I did, knowing that, was to really think about a diverse board. And I get frustrated because I think people use that word diversity too loosely. I'm not talking about diverse just from a racial and ethnic perspective. I'm talking about diversity from age, gender, socioeconomic backgrounds. You need all these different perspectives at the table when you're really trying to do something transformational. And so for me, I was intentional about putting a board together that was very diverse in all of those categories, but also a board with folks who had, um, what's the word, who had standing, right, in the community. And people knew those last names. So I wanted to mitigate any notion of risk, when I went out to ask for money, because I wasn't going to be asking, for small gifts. I was going to be asking for large, equitable gifts, just like these other green spaces got. And I got to give some credit to a couple of our partners, because I watched them early on come into the community and be present, sit, listen, and learn. I watched, Elizabeth Love, Ann Stern, both from the Houston Endowment, sit in churches and in community meetings. I watched Nancy Kinder sit there and listen, and they were present, and they got to learn and understand the dynamics of the community. And I think it made them better partners. But also in my mind, the way I thought about was, okay, this is great. Now, how do I leverage them into more money, right? So I don't necessarily depend on them. I think they're great partners to have. They have done big things as it relates to being a great partner, but we're leveraging them to go after other big partners to create that, again, high tide, all boats rise environment. Because I think it's tough, when you just think about community, this work is hard work. I mean,
Yes.
you deal with a lot of pain, hurt, historical disinvestment, and then you have to manage, some folks over here. Then you got to bring some folks along over here. So it's like conductor.
You're holding it in all intention.
You're trying to put a good concert on, and so it's hard work. And so for me, it's really about dispelling those notions around risk, and how do you get them in the boat with you as a true partner, and not having them think that when it comes to organizations of color, it's charity versus investment.
Right.
Now, Renee, I want to say that again. That's extremely important.
Say it again, and then I've got to move
Okay,
us in a little bit of a direction because we're running out of time. Say it one more time.
This ain't charity, it is investment.
Yes, our goal is to be here for all donors and to be here for our entire community, and to try to, ensure that we all can wrestle with difficult questions and think about the long-term interests of our community. So I want to give you both the chance just to give a closing comment before I turn it over to Diane. And if you would just say one thing, what advice do you have? You've given our donors and everyone listening a lot of advice, but if you have a closing comment about how you think people should approach this guide, and also about just, how they might approach their learning journey. And let's make it a minute each, just because we're a little over time, and then we'll continue to answer in other ways the questions that have been raised. Holly?
Well, it's clear that Ramon and I can speak in sermons, so this will challenge us. So there's three sort of things I'd summarize with. One is proximity. Again, you got to get proximate. I think Ramon, and being intentional about building a board, created a situation in which people could get proximate without always asking the community to do the labor of educating those who need to be taught. So that brings me to a second point, which is creating opportunities for learning groups, which I think GHCF can be an instrumental part of, right? For philanthropists, wealth holders, et cetera, who are not so sure about how to enter the water, creating opportunities for learning groups with other white wealth holders, honestly, because that can be unpacked in another room. And then data, lean on the data, it's already there. And that also allows for, philanthropists created these rules, they can change them. And we need to build different systems that are about inclusion and equity. If you remove There's a beautiful video. If you remove a wolf from Yellowstone Park, the whole park falls into disorder, right? But the wolf, when included in the ecosystem, it creates harmony. It creates a balance. So we need to balance our ecosystems. And the last thing I'll say is an analogy from, well, the second to last thing I'll say is to create a long-term plan. We are in a moment. Our nation is in a moment right now that was brought about in some ways by the murder of George Floyd. We need to extend past this moment. We need to create a long-term plan that is sustainable, that allows for a lens on equity and a lens on empowering, not on charity, as Ramon said. And I'll use this last analogy, and it comes directly from Howard Thurman, who was a mentor of Martin Luther King's. He said, we can choose to be a swamp, a reservoir, or a river. A swamp takes water in and keeps it there. And in swamps, things die. A reservoir takes in water and releases it a little bit at a time. A river is a constantly flowing, adapting, and creative entity. So rivers form things like the Grand Canyon. So just take your pick.
A beautiful analogy. I think we all want to be part of creating the river. At least I know it at the Community Foundation we do. Really appreciate your thoughts and your challenging comments, challenging in a very positive way. I mean, Holly. Ramon?
You know, as you think about your giving, there's a moral argument, an economic argument, a historical argument. And we don't have the time for me to go into each one of those, but let me just make this really, really simple. If you think about a portfolio of investments, you don't want to be overweighted in one asset class versus another. So as you think about your portfolio and your philanthropy being a part of your portfolio, why would you want to continue to fund the same thing over and over and over again and not diversify your portfolio? So as I look at a portfolio, you really, really need to be thinking about how can you add different asset classes in your portfolio of giving. And then you evaluate where the returns are coming from in each of those asset classes in your portfolio and tweak and adjust your giving. Historically, these organizations have been underweighted, to say the least. So as I think about a portfolio of investments, I look where I can get the most alpha and the biggest return. And as I think about communities and the communities of color and the work that's currently being done, this is where you get the most alpha, baby. Come on in, the water's warm. I'll stop there. You're on mute, Renee.
Sorry, thank you. I appreciate that. We're gonna transfer now back to Diane. Thanks to Ramon and Holly for sharing your ideas and thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. I like both of your closing comments so well. Yes, we do need to extend past this moment, and we do want everyone to come on in. The water is warm. The final, we got a couple more slides for you as we start to close out. Amaretta Morris, Director of National Community Strategies at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, has stated that there are really 3 C's to focus on as we start thinking about this work. And that is connect, those words are connect, celebrate, and commit. In relationship to today, we want you to connect with others, share the link, provide us with the names of other Black-led organizations that we may have missed, and we understand that we did miss organizations. You can reach out to us at connect@ghcf.org. And as Renee stated earlier, this is a living site. We will update the site. We will constantly be making changes to it. Celebrate the work that we're all striving to do, and commit to moving resources. Commit to listening and learning. GHCF is committing to collecting data and continuing to be transparent about the work that we're doing. This last quote is from the article, Racial Equity and Philanthropy, Disparities in Funding for Leaders of Color Leave Impact on the Table. And it states, Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous dream was for a society that did not judge people by the color of their skin, not for one that did not see the color of people's skins. Judging and seeing are not the same. A nation that does not judge people based on color is one where equity can be realized, while not seeing color risk ignoring the race-based inequities that exist. And that's what we've been saying all along. That's what our speakers have been talking about. So as we all do our own work, this is a reminder that GHCF is here and ready to serve. If you want advising, or if you need or want to have a discussion on this topic, as you think about your own giving, we are here for you. As you leave today's webinar, a survey will pop up, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would provide feedback about today. The survey will also ask if you have interest in participating in an Equity Institute that we are looking to initiate for the second half of 2021. This institute will provide a learning opportunity for those who want to make a commitment to deeper learning, and is another way in which GHCF will commit to helping our donors go deeper. Within the next week, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording of today's webinar. A big thank you to my colleagues that help behind the scenes: Rachel Young, Alicia Jacobs, Allison Sullivan, and Annie Hurwitz. To our guests, thank you for allowing us into your homes or wherever you may be. A big thank you to Holly and Ramon for your insight and for your candor, which was appreciated. And last but not least, certainly a big thank you to the nonprofits that have allowed us to uplift their good work and a guide for Houston philanthropy. And if we did not answer your question, we will go through the questions and we will try to respond back to you directly. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for being here. Please visit the site, connect, celebrate, and commit. And thank you. Have a good afternoon.